All right, so this is the current progress of my SIP so far. You might notice that I've already pre-spawned in a third player character pawn. This is because for whatever reason Unreal Engine 5 decided to break my character pawn and make it so that the avatar for my character when I use the network start always starts at origin 000. It does not move from there. Even when I tried to drag in the third player character pawn, it had attempted to place the character pawn at origin yet again. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be possessing a pre-spawned in character pawn in order to demo the content. So for the people not wanting to watch the whole 45 something minute dissertation that I'm going to have for my SIP, I'm just going to go ahead and demo the stuff right here. So as you can see, these are the zones that the player needs to be in order to interact and change the probability of an event occurring. And as you can see, instead of having a pop-up user interface, which I think would take away from the gameplay and the rapid interactivity of the event, the player just has to go to a given location in order to interact with the probability change. And as you can see here, it's saying that I'm changing multiple probabilities. This pop-up actually controls the probabilities of all of these pop-up pillars here. And as you can see, when it interacts with the player, we have definite interaction because when the player runs over them, they pop up, they do a raid cast, and they add impulse, just like that. Then over here, we have this interactor. And what this does is it just goes up and down, as you can see through the pillar moving through my player character. You can see it getting up and going smaller as I decrease the probabilities. So we have an in-environment feedback for possibilities and potential. This one, as you can see here, dumps a bunch of debris on the player when the player moves into the zone. And this directly corresponds to how much debris. See, and there it is at its minimum, which means there is none. Every time I run through it, it just prints the string saying that my pawn has, that a pawn has entered the collapse zone. So my game mechanic was the ability to change the percentiles and likelihood of an event occurring within the game engine. And as you can see, after I've changed the likelihood of it occurring, any pawn can trigger it right now, and I just did that for demo purposes. Later I'll specifically specify like the NPCs, which type of NPC can actually trigger it, which is really convenient later on for animation purposes, because if I only want certain characters to be able to trigger the events, then I can only specify that certain actors can trigger it. So since we're not really concerned about the actors and not doing anything really special with the pawns, I'll just jump straight into it. So spawning box. Spawning box is what spawns all of the collapsed objects, and the cube spawn and everything else really isn't that interesting. I'm just throwing on some variables to give it a bit of noise and make it look more interesting. Randomly adjusting the sizes, changing its rotation velocity, adding impulse to it, doing a bit of scatter for the spawn location, like right here. So this affects the disbursement, i.e. Where the object originally spawns when it spawns over the player as the event is triggered. This just gets the spawn area, which is actually a submember of the spawn box class itself. And this is just noise. I'm really just adding in noise in order to make it spawn what I want it to spawn. That's it. Spawn shower doesn't do anything. It's defunct. The actual execution of the script occurs here. Produces the falling stones on a variable sized loop. So how much debris I want to spawn, it just runs through this loop until it spawns everything. And when it's done spawning everything, it sets this to false. So It's just set on a timer and it has to be on the main event board in order to take advantage of timed events. But that's all that's really up to it. That was used as a demo. So here, right here, is when the outside control agent tells it to change the probability, it goes ahead and it will push the change. It's also what was pushing the message that you were seeing for debug. And when it does the print screen, it's just printing on the screen. So it's just giving you notice that it's printing. And here's the pop-up pillar. The pop-up pillar is pretty much identical to the same way that the spawning box works. The only difference is in how the classes themselves are being accessed, or how the objects themselves are being accessed. So for the spawn box, we have a single control area. We have a single control area, this area, that controls just this. Just this. And I know, Mr. Henry, as the SME, you prefer it when the variables are accessible in the inspector, because it saves times for the programmer and it lets the designers do more. So as you can see over here, we are actually able to assign which collapse object is being controlled right here in the inspector without having to go into the code or anything else. And then over here, you can see we have the same kind of a setup. We have a scalable array which will control multiple different pop-ups. So this array will this object, this control zone, will actually affect all of the various pop-ups here. And now the reason that I went with having control zones, where in which a third-person character can move into it and directly affect the interactable objects next to it, is I felt that actually having a pop-up UI come up and get in the player's face would be detrimental to the immersion and a little bit of a cop-out. So what I did instead is, as you can see, there's these control zones which are clearly denoted by objects, simple objects right now. It probably could be upscaled to something more interesting like a particle effect area with the variable controls for the size. Because as you see, when you change the size on this, it will, when you change the chance, the pillar will change as well. So when the player moves into it and they press T to increase the likelihood of the event, or they press G to decrease the likelihood of the event, you will go ahead and see the pillar change shape and, well, change size. It'll get more condensed. And I felt this was the better way to deal with the user interface controls, because due to how the events occur and how rapidly they trigger, moving into the box, and let's go ahead and look at the just how the controls, let's go straight to how the controls are doing it. So this is pretty straightforward. On component overlap, it attempts to cast to the third person character, which is the character that the player is using. In this instance, me. It will check to see if the player is in the box. If the player is indeed in the box, then it will go ahead and enable the input and check the true state and set the true state for player in box. The interesting thing for this is that if you have multiple objects attempting to compete for a single input, you interact with neither. So what this basically just does, this entire thing right here, enables and disables user interactions with control zone. That's it. That is the sum entirety of what this does. But the fantastic thing that this code does is it means that when the player moves into the hitbox, this, because I have a collider there, a box collider, and it's just set to overlap all. It's very simple execution, really. And what that does is that when the player moves into the control zone, is it enables them to interact with it. And then we just scoot up here a little bit, and you see this nice, wonderful, long, flowing length of redundancy. The only difference between the two is literally the top one T increments it up, and the bottom one G increments it down. That's it. That is literally it. See? Plus, minus. That's it. So I come from database entry, which means I love sanitizing my inputs. So the player can't set a percentile chance greater than 1%. Technically, Unreal doesn't care because of the way the percentiles are set up. I just do it so that it does a value from 0 to 1 for the sake of my own sanity. And it just increments it by 5%. The interesting thing is that in order to keep the visual indicator for it from disappearing, I just have to make sure that the absolute value when I change the scale of the pillar, which represents the current percentage, never drops below 0.01, because otherwise it would visually disappear. Because if it had a scale of 0 in a given direction, it just poof, vanishes. That's pretty much it. So for setting the percentiles, we go from left to right here, and it just goes ahead and says if it's over 100, if it's over 1, it sets it back down to 1. If it's under 0, it sets it back down to 0. It sets it back to 0. And then if the chance of happening is actually 0, it just makes sure it uses this upper one for the absolute one so that you can still see the pillar, even if the pillar is not doing anything. This is just cosmetic stuff. I'd probably replace this with the stuff necessary to alter the particle effects when I do the final build. I just felt that this would be more convenient for the display and give it that visual attachment so that when you see this bob, when you see the turn, you know, okay, this is something that I can interact with, and then you're able to walk through it because, of course, the collision settings for the base and the pillar here are set to none, no collision. They are just literally there for aesthetics, that's it. And the pillar of chance itself is just there to directly reflect the probabilities as a visual indicator. So if it's 100, it's at its full length. If it's half, it's at its half length. Now with the initial setup, I'm not actually scaling it on startup, which is simple to do. I'll probably do this before I, well, I'll do this after I get done with the video. But for now, as proof of concept to show that I'm in line with the SIP and that I have accomplished implementing the mechanic as is necessary, or I've executed an example, 2 examples of the mechanic so far with the rock slide effect here and the pop-up pillars over here. And the control zones will allow the player to directly interact with the probabilities and chances of the event occurring during gameplay, which I've accomplished the center concepts of, okay, here's my SIP mechanic, okay, here's how it's implemented and used in at least 2 instances. For the rest of the SIP, I am going to work on ways in which these events make gameplay. So I have the ability to control the SIP, or not control the SIP, to alter the probability to occur, to alter the likelihood of an event occurring within the game, Scales of Fate, and to do that in a very accessible fashion. I'm quite happy about the way that I have the player interacting with the world itself. So for like and I did this specifically because of this, but for the pop-up pillars, since there's multiple of them and you want to control them all at the same time, you just use the for each loop. So I just use a for each loop. I call the event, which is in the pop-up pillar itself. The event here just changes the likelihood of it happening. And then on component begin overlap. So when a pawn enters the effect area, any pawn, including my player character, just for the sake of demonstration right now, but I could very easily change this to cast to NPC, cast a generic NPC. So then it would only trigger on an NPC. The player character could move through it like nobody's business. Then eventually, in order to make the player feel ghosty, feel nebulous, I'm probably going to tamper with the colliders for the player character so that the player character can just move straight through these objects and only by necessity interact with the overlaps of the actual control zones. This is just other niceties that I've put on it. So for this one, I'm doing a raycast. The raycast is what caused the player to pop up because it was adding a impulse to the player, to the pawn. Pretty much anything it runs into, it'll go ahead and do it. Or, well, I shouldn't say that. Any pawn that it runs into that has a character component, specifically for the character movement, it'll go ahead and add the impulse to. But other than that, it's not really a complex system. I really strove towards KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And the result shows in the fact that I have a very simple implementation of a single game mechanic, which allows the player to adjust the probabilities of an event occurring. Now I need to take what I've learned through the development of the current levels of design, and I just need to go ahead and polish those a touch more and come up with additional events for the player to mess with. And I'm thinking if I have enough time left over, I can probably do something a bit fancier with the NPC AI, make them move in controlled groups, that kind of stuff. You know, just the flocking intelligence. Use a moving sphere for the AI to gather around in, and use offsets from the center location of that sphere in order to get the AI to move in a herd-like manner, which would be realistic for the setting, i.e. the subway. But as things go so far, I'm really happy with the set progress. So I have my control zones, which are really easy to repurpose. Due to the way that they work, I can place this wherever. They are not intrinsically the same object. This just uses a reference of this one. Come on. Yes, this just uses a reference of the spawn box. So this control zone could really be anywhere on the map. It just has to have the access link to this, and that's it. And this could be anywhere on the map, and it just has to have access to one of these. And the interesting thing is I could actually take this and use it to control one of these. Or, well, I could use one like this and only have it control one pop-up, have it control 3, have it control 20. It's just the design principle of changing how likely these are to occur. And with the way that I've set this up, it is really rapid to retool it to control something else. So if I came up with like a light switch short for whatever reason, I could use one of these to control how likely the light switch is to short out when it changes. So I could set it up so that if the light switch shorts out, I just shut these off. Or if somebody's standing in water and the light switch shorts out, it could fry them. And it is really simple to set up any one of these trigger zone events to one of these control zone events to change its probability. And all the player has to do is move within the box to change the probability. No menus, no clicking through menus, no additional buttons, no user interface to get in the way of seeing the events actually occur. I'm very happy with the solution that I came up with to get the player and keep the player immersed in the world, changing the probabilities on the fly and still being able to see the events happen, not being stuck in a menu as they're changing the events. So then the backfeed from this would end up, of course, being if I was going to do some currency system, I'd either have to store it in the level or I'd have to store it in the player, but it's not that hard. It just ended up being another reference stacked on the end of this. So after they changed the event, so for like this one, let's say I'm controlling multiple objects. If I want to say coincidence currency, the coin, or the possibility, I would for one of these for each ones when it's controlling multiple objects, I would push whatever the delta change in the currency is going to be to the player for each of the loops because it's going to be reflecting a change on each object. But say for this one, when we get down here, it only occurs once. It only fires the one time. And that's it. So for the project for SIP, for Scales of Fate, when it comes to the game mechanics, exploring the game mechanics and getting the game mechanic itself functioning, I already have fully working examples of both manipulating the probability of a single object and manipulating the probability of multiple objects simultaneously, all within the zone, as well as with the user interface method, the way that the player will interact with the mechanic and cause the mechanic to produce the starting elements of gameplay. Because this isn't the SIP, as I was repeatedly told, is not meant to be a full playable game, for me at least. It is just meant to be a showcase of a single game mechanic. And my single game mechanic is changing the probability of an event occurring. That's it. This has been Eric Marshall presenting my SIP, Scales of Fate. Thank you for your time.